My future mother-in-law raised her champagne glass in the middle of my engagement party and announced a prenup to protect their family fortune. The only problem was that the fortune she was talking about was technically mine. The ballroom fell quiet the moment Victoria Langford tapped her glass with a manicured fingernail, the kind of sharp sound that makes an entire room pause mid-conversation, and every guest in that glittering hall slowly turned toward her like an audience waiting for a performance. I stood beside my fiancé Daniel near the center of the room, my fingers still loosely wrapped around the stem of a champagne flute, smiling politely the way you do when you think someone is about to make a sweet toast. The engagement party had been extravagant, even by Manhattan standards. Crystal chandeliers glowing overhead, violin music floating through the air, white orchids on every table, and the city skyline stretching behind the glass walls like a painting. Daniel's family had insisted on hosting it, and they made sure everyone knew how generous they were being about it. Victoria smiled brightly at the crowd, her diamond earrings catching the light, and said, "Before we celebrate too much, I think it's important we address something practical." A few guests chuckled politely. My smile stayed in place, but I felt Daniel shift slightly beside me. "You see," she continued, her eyes drifting toward me with a sweetness that felt oddly rehearsed, "our family has worked very hard to build what we have, and when someone new enters a family with significant assets, it's only responsible to protect that legacy." A quiet ripple moved through the room. My stomach tightened, but I kept my posture calm. She wasn't really doing this, was she? "So Daniel and I agreed," she said smoothly, "that a prenuptial agreement would be best. Nothing personal, of course, just a way to make sure our family wealth remains secure." A few guests nodded approvingly. Someone near the bar whispered something that made a couple people laugh softly. I slowly turned my head toward Daniel, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he just stared at the floor for a second before forcing an awkward smile toward the guests. That silence told me everything I needed to know. Victoria lifted her glass again. "After all," she added lightly, "these days you never know who might be marrying for money." The words floated across the room like perfume, sweet but suffocating. I heard someone murmur, "Well, she's not wrong." Another voice said, "Smart woman." My cheeks felt warm, but I refused to look embarrassed. Instead, I took a slow sip of champagne and watched Victoria as if she had just delivered a mildly amusing speech instead of publicly implying I was a gold digger. The irony of the moment was almost funny. Almost. Because the truth was something Victoria Langford didn't know, and neither did the dozens of wealthy guests applauding her little speech. They believed I was the quiet girl Daniel met at a charity gala 6 months ago. They believed I was the woman marrying into their powerful family. What they didn't know was that the investment firm managing most of the Langford family's fortune had only one controlling trustee, and her name was Evelyn Carter. Mine. I was still deciding whether to say anything when the ballroom doors suddenly opened behind the guests, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside holding a leather folder, scanning the room like he was searching for someone important. A few seconds later, his eyes landed directly on me, and he started walking over. The man in the dark suit walked through the ballroom with quiet confidence, the kind that made people instinctively move out of his way without even realizing it. And as he approached our group, I noticed the subtle shift in the room's energy. Guests turning their heads, conversations fading, curiosity spreading like a ripple across the polished marble floor. He looked slightly out of place among the glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos, not because he wasn't well-dressed, but because his expression carried the calm seriousness of someone who had come to handle business, not sip champagne and admire orchids. Victoria noticed him too and frowned faintly, clearly irritated that her carefully staged speech had been interrupted. The man stopped a few feet from us and glanced down at the leather folder in his hand before speaking. "Excuse me," he said politely, his voice firm but professional. "I'm looking for Ms. Evelyn Carter." For a moment, nobody moved. Victoria blinked, confused, and Daniel glanced around the room as if expecting someone else to step forward. I gently set my champagne glass on a passing tray and lifted my hand slightly. "That would be me," I said calmly. The man immediately nodded with recognition, the kind of respectful acknowledgement you give someone whose name you already know very well. "Good evening, Miss Carter," he said. "I apologize for interrupting your event. I'm Jonathan Hale from Sterling Private Bank." I saw Daniel's eyebrows crease slightly at the name. Victoria looked mildly annoyed. "And why exactly are you interrupting our family celebration?" she asked sharply, her tone carrying the same authority she used when commanding hotel staff or waiters. Jonathan didn't even glance at her. His attention stayed on me. "We've been trying to reach you for the last hour regarding the Langford capital transfer," he explained, opening the folder. "Since the authorization deadline is tonight, the board asked me to deliver the documents in person." A quiet murmur moved through the nearby guests. I could practically feel Victoria stiffen beside me. "Transfer?" she repeated slowly. Jonathan nodded, still speaking to me. "The $42 million liquidity reallocation tied to the Langford family portfolio. As the controlling trustee, your approval is required before midnight." The words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have. Daniel turned toward me with a confused expression, like someone trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly had too many pieces. Victoria let out a small laugh, though it sounded forced. "I'm sorry," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "I think you must have the wrong person. This is my son's fiancé." Jonathan's expression didn't change. "Yes," he replied calmly. "Ms. Carter is also the majority trustee of the Carter Investment Trust, which currently manages several of the Langford family's holdings." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to touch. I watched Victoria's confident smile begin to fade as the realization slowly crept into her eyes. Daniel looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Guests who had been whispering a few minutes ago were now staring openly, their curiosity turning into disbelief. I accepted the folder from Jonathan and glanced briefly at the documents, though I already knew exactly what they contained. The Langford portfolio had been struggling for months, and the emergency transfer they were requesting was the only thing keeping one of their biggest ventures from collapsing, which meant something Victoria Langford had clearly forgotten during her little speech about protecting family wealth. I closed the folder slowly and looked up at her, offering a small, polite smile. "It seems," I said calmly, "that before we discuss prenups, we should probably discuss who's actually protecting whose fortune." And the room went completely silent. The silence that followed felt heavier than the chandeliers hanging above us, and for the first time since I had known her, Victoria Langford looked completely unsure of herself. Her eyes moved from me to the folder in my hands and then to Jonathan Hale, as if hoping someone would correct what she had just heard. "That's ridiculous," she said finally, though the confidence in her voice had cracked. "Our family manages our own assets." Jonathan's expression stayed politely neutral. "Respectfully, Mrs. Langford, the majority of your family's holdings have been under the Carter Investment Trust since your husband consolidated them 3 years ago," he explained. A few guests gasped quietly, clearly realizing they had just witnessed something they weren't supposed to. Daniel turned to me again, confusion now mixed with embarrassment. "Evelyn, what is he talking about?" he asked, lowering his voice as if the answer might somehow stay private if he whispered it. I met his eyes calmly. "Your family's investments were restructured through my firm," I said. "Your father approved the agreement before he retired." Victoria's face flushed a deep shade of red. "That is not possible," she snapped. "We would never allow some outsider to control our fortune." I tilted my head slightly, still calm. "Technically, Mrs. Langford, I don't control it," I said. "I protect it." Jonathan gently cleared his throat. "And right now, that protection requires Miss Carter's authorization for the $42 million liquidity transfer," he added, tapping the document. Without her approval, the Langford Capital Expansion Project will default by morning. The reaction from the guests was immediate, whispers spreading like wildfire as people began piecing together what that meant. I could see the exact moment Victoria realized that the party she had turned into a stage for humiliating me had suddenly become a stage for something else entirely. Her voice softened slightly when she spoke again, the edge of arrogance replaced with something closer to caution. "Well," she said, forcing a thin smile, "if that's the case, I'm sure Evelyn would be happy to help family." I held her gaze for a moment before answering. "That depends," I said quietly. Daniel stepped closer to me, his voice urgent now. "Evelyn, if there's some misunderstanding tonight, we can talk about it privately," he said quickly. "My mother didn't mean anything by what she said." I raised an eyebrow. "She announced a prenup to protect your family wealth from me," I reminded him calmly. Around us, guests pretended not to listen while clearly hearing every word. Victoria straightened her shoulders. "It was simply a responsible suggestion," she said. "Surely you understand that." I looked down at the folder again before closing it with a soft snap. "Oh, I understand perfectly," I replied. Then I handed the documents back to Jonathan. "Canceled the transfer." The reaction was instant. "What?" Daniel said, his voice rising in disbelief. Jonathan hesitated slightly. "Miss Carter, the board expects—" "Cancel it," I repeated calmly. He nodded once and stepped aside to make the call. Victoria's composure finally shattered. "You can't do that," she said sharply. "That project is worth hundreds of millions." I gave her a small, polite smile, the same one I had worn when she called me a gold digger 20 minutes earlier. "You're absolutely right, which is why you should be very careful who you try to humiliate in public." Daniel stared at me like the woman he thought he knew had disappeared. I slipped my engagement ring off slowly and placed it on the nearby table beside my untouched champagne glass. "Good luck protecting your family fortune," I added calmly, before turning for the exit. Behind me, the ballroom erupted into chaos, but I didn't look back. Because the one thing Victoria Langford had been right about was that family wealth should always be protected. She just never realized the person protecting it was the same woman she had tried to humiliate in front of the entire room.